Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online. News that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Thank you for joining us on this special edition of Newsmakers. I'm Fred Martino. New Mexico has faced severe drought conditions this year. It's difficult for agriculture, particularly after a dry winter and little snowmelt to replenish the Elephant Butte Reservoir. Wildfires also continue to be a threat. But these short-term problems are just the beginning. Experts say climate change means many more dry years ahead and grave challenges for our water supply. In 2015, former KRWG reporter Simon Thompson spent a year traveling the state to understand our water future.
This is the time to take stock of ourselves. Up the winding Rio Grande from El Paso, in a region that for 300 years was under the flags of Spain and Mexico, is the Mesilla Valley, transformed by American enterprise from desert to a garden spot, producing premium cotton, truck crops, pecans, and other irrigated farm products in profusion.
The mindset of a more optimistic time. But even then, during the 1950s, southern New Mexico was in the midst of a severe drought. The Elephant Butte Reservoir was built in 1916 to store a water supply to sustain the region through the years, whether they be wet or dry.
God said, let there be water, and there was water in the middle of the desert.
Yes, exactly what she said.
Las Cruces, April Reddy and Diane Reyes are spending Memorial Weekend boating, skiing and partying on the lake. Over vacations throughout the years, Reyes has seen New Mexico's largest body of water shrink from this to this during the drought. In June of 2015, it was just 18% full.
It's crazy because I've been here and you jump off the cliffs, and then the next year when you come around and you want to jump off, it's so low that it's like, wow, those rocks were really under there. We've been jumping off those cliffs. I'm amazed we didn't hit our heads or break a leg or something.
The Elephant Butte Dam was built to store snowmelt flowing down from northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. Reyes and thousands of others spent their Memorial Weekend celebrating on a critical river water supply belonging to users in New Mexico, El Paso, Texas, and Mexico. The end of the holiday is just the beginning of irrigation season for farmers below the dam in the Hatch and Mesilla Valleys. Elephant Butte Irrigation District consultant and civil engineer Phil King is overseeing the release that will make the desert bloom.
In our desert here, if you don't have irrigation, you can't really grow a crop. You know, if you look at the natural vegetation that grows just under rainfall here, it's all these, grasses and mesquite and desert plants. There are no real viable crops to grow in that kind of an environment. So in these situations, if you don't irrigate, you don't grow a crop.
As the gates open, the Rio Grande is set loose for the first time in 9 months, quenching the dry riverbeds through Hatch, the Mesilla Valley, El Paso, and on to Mexico. Las Cruces Magdalena Moreno is one of the many who came to see the surge of water fill the riverbed and flow on past Las Cruces.
I mean, this is what New Mexicans live for. I mean, this is what we wait for every year. It's just an exciting time. It's what keeps our state flowing, what keeps our agriculture and our life growing, and it's really nice.
According to the U.S. Geological Survey, New Mexico has the smallest surface water supply of any western state. In the southern region, most of that water is used to grow alfalfa, green chili, pecans, and onions. But it's also the primary source of groundwater recharge for the Mesilla Bolson Aquifer, where all Las Cruces like Magdalena Moreno get their drinking water. Sam Fernald is director of the Water Resources Research Institute at New Mexico State University. Fernald says lower surface water supplies not only mean the aquifer isn't getting recharged due to less surface water seeping into the ground, but farmers are pumping more water out of the aquifer at a higher rate to make up the difference.
Without that recharge, without the surface water, without the precipitation that soaks into the ground, then you start getting into a situation where you're extracting more than you're recharging.
A few years ago, the small New Mexico village of Magdalena went dry. Hydrologists regard the village as a canary in the coal mine, a taste of what the future could hold for New Mexico if rising temperatures and scarce water supplies aren't managed for the future. 2 years on, the water crisis is resculpting the state's groundwater policy. Back in June 2013, New Mexico was in the grips of a historic drought that many parts of the state are still facing. In the village of Magdalena in central New Mexico, water utilities manager Steve Bailey heard from customers saying they were getting air bubbles in their water lines. So Bailey went to check the village water well.
We don't have any water in this well. No warning, no anything, nothing to tell me that, this was coming.
The water level was sitting just below the water pump's reach, and according to Bailey, 15 feet lower than the last time he'd checked. The mayor called an emergency meeting and told the townspeople they had a day, 2 days at most, before the village would run completely out of water.
It was quite the mob scene, to stand in front of, what people did show up, who were very upset, what is going on? What happened to the water? What did you guys do wrong?
Emergency water tanks, bottled water and porta potties were trucked in from surrounding towns. Stacey Timmons with the New Mexico Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources came to assess the well and the situation.
People were in a daze. It was unbelievable. It was a complete shock that this is what was going on in this town. They were kind of walking around like zombies in some way, because you turn on the faucet and nothing comes out, and it's hard to believe how much that actually affects a person.
Despite the water restrictions, some businesses continue to operate. To keep her doors open at the M&M Cafe and Hotel, Linda Mansell brought in 2 porta potties and secured enough water from friends and neighboring Socorro.
I was just kind of using the tactics that I would have used if I was out in the woods, or like if I was serving for the Forest Service people out in the field and stuff, and you just take your water and boiling water and stuff like that, and just you have your certain tubs with chlorine and clean water and paper plates and stuff like that too. So
Mansell says she lost some of her permanent hotel tenants and they had to serve food on paper plates. Other businesses were not so fortunate. The well's failure dealt a death blow to Magdalena's only coin laundry. It's now a propane supply store. Other firms saw major losses when the village cancelled its annual heritage event, the Old Timers Reunion. Mansell says it brings as many as 1,000 people into town every year.
It'll give us about maybe 50% of kickstart for another, through the winter.
A group of local businesses, including the owners of the laundromat, have filed a lawsuit against the village for their losses, citing negligence in maintaining the main well and alternative wells. Bailey says he checked the main well every year as he was supposed to. He says it was beyond his control.
That, as far as I'm concerned, was, act of God, or whatever you want to call it.
But New Mexico tech hydrologist Fred Phillips says when you look at the temperatures, rainfall and capacity of Magdalena's well, it isn't all that surprising the village went dry.
Is it just like lightning striking out of the blue, or is it something that maybe we could understand and predict and give people some warning of? Well, the answer is that yes, it probably can be predicted.
But Phillips says predictions are not always available to small villages like Magdalena with limited resources and expertise. And that's what Phillips is working to change. Using Magdalena as a model, he's developing a user-friendly groundwater monitoring service that would allow water utilities throughout the state to get information and receive electronic alerts if groundwater drops to dangerously low levels, such as those seen in Magdalena.
The National Weather Service now provides us with warnings about things like flash floods, about tornadoes, about heat waves, and so on. People make use of those warnings to do all kinds of things. They're just a routine facet of our everyday life. We don't have any warnings now about things like water levels declining and wells going dry. But there's no reason that we shouldn't.
Stacey Timmons with the New Mexico Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources says the project could be expanded statewide in the next 3 years. But she says enhancing resources is only half the battle. Timmons says the Magdalena crisis highlighted concerns about water regulation in New Mexico.
They only require that communities measure their well water level once per year, and it had been done. The individual in Magdalena had been doing exactly what he was told. He measured it once per year.
Magdalena residents and business owners like Mansell have cut their water use dramatically since the town went dry. Per person daily use dropped from as much as 175 gallons before the water crisis to around 75 gallons today. By comparison, Las Cruces residents average about 166 gallons a day.
I have cut down a lot on the water, knowing that we don't need to use that much, and I do that at home also. Plus I have big tubs. When that water comes down from the rain, it comes in some big tubs at the house and stuff, so I try to use that for my plants.
Magdalena's water supply has since stabilized, but Phillips says had it not been for some of the heaviest rain on record in the September after the crisis, the town might still be recovering. Water Utilities Manager Steve Bailey says the village spent upwards of $200,000 to get 2 out-of-use water wells back online. He now checks the town's water wells every single month. Many water conservation campaigns focus on taking shorter showers or trading in our lawns for desert plants, but those measures can only make a dent in the water shortfall. In our region, agriculture uses more than 85% of the water. Greg Davier is a pecan farmer. In his hands are the budding branches of a young pecan tree planted 3 years ago in the heat of the drought.
If you can't grow it for more than 20 years, you're probably going to lose money overall.
Pecans are a heavy water use fruit crop. Unlike onions, chili and alfalfa, which are planted each year, pecan trees are permanent crops that cannot survive without water. Davier is on the board of the New Mexico pecan growers. The group is developing water sharing agreements between Mesilla Valley farmers. They also advocate for the latest water efficiency technology and irrigation techniques. Davier says these measures and the ability to draw on groundwater supplies gives farmers flexibility, allowing pecan crops to thrive even in dry conditions.
When we pump groundwater and we actually deplete the aquifer during a drought, it provides us a benefit that frequently gets missed, and that is the idea that there's some place to put the water when it gets wet again. If your bucket is always full, when it rains, your bucket will flood.
The Mesilla Bolson, the aquifer that farmers like Davier are drawing from, is also where the city of Las Cruces gets its residential water supply, and it's dropped 15 feet in 15 years. The Hueco Bolson, the aquifer below El Paso, dropped 55 feet in the same amount of time.
The longer that you don't recharge your bucket, the more risk you have that you're dipping into the non-renewable groundwater.
Farmers are having to drill wells deeper and deeper into the aquifer, but some farmers like Davier say they're not worried. They point to the 1980s, when heavier precipitation refilled water pumped out of the aquifer during the drought of the 1950s.
It's going to be wet again. There will be a time that we have more water than we have today.
But a 2015 NASA climate study suggests those wetter years won't be coming anytime soon. What will be is an even harsher drought projected to last as long as 30 years. University of New Mexico Professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences David Gutzler says these are conditions that climate change could make permanent.
There is no doubt that the state will have to learn to adapt to whatever climate change happens to some extent. And that may require some significant changes to the way we manage and allocate water in ways that no single scientist or any single policymaker can determine. But the first step is to acknowledge that these changes are underway and to recognize the potential impacts that they're going to have on the whole water system.
Davier says he's not fully convinced those projections will come to be.
I'm going to grow what's most profitable. Ultimately, what I'm saying is I'm going to grow what consumers choose that I grow. and they simply relate that to me through dollar signs.
According to USDA data, per pound pecan prices increased by more than 30% since the drought began in 2002. And during the same period, pecan acreage in New Mexico increased by about 20%. While pecans boom with demand from China, here in the Hatch Valley, dependence on groundwater is creating its own problems for farmers growing the state's most celebrated crop, green chili. Green chili cheeseburgers, green chili enchiladas, even green chili peanut brittle. New Mexicans' love for green chili runs deep, so much so the New Mexico legislature passed a law cracking down on growers falsely marketing their produce as New Mexico green chili. Stephanie Walker is a vegetable specialist at the New Mexico State University's Chili Pepper Institute.
Really, once people know and love green chili, you have to keep coming back for it. And so I think protecting the name is very, very important.
Imposters, labour shortages and rival markets have caused challenges that drier conditions are only compounding. Scott Adams has been farming in the Hatch Valley for 30 years. He says lower river water supplies from the Rio Grande have led chili and onion farmers to pumping more water out of the ground to make up the shortage. But the aquifer below the Hatch Valley is shallow, and it concentrates the salt content in the water. New Mexico State University studies estimate increased pumping in the past few years has quadrupled salt content in the Hatch Valley's groundwater.
It's like if you tried to grow crops in seawater, they wouldn't grow.
Here you can see the crusty residue of salty groundwater. It weakens crops and decreases yields, even with enhanced techniques that have allowed farmers to grow 7 times more chili per acre. Production is down 40% from record highs 10 years ago. Phil King says this caustic relationship between salt groundwater and lower surface water supplies has made the Hatch Valley the most vulnerable area in the irrigation district.
Number one, they have so much less capacity in their aquifer to buffer, the wet years with the dry years. But then to have this persistent salt problem is just, insult to injury.
Walker says without river water or consistent rainfall, the salt remains in the soil.
That salt tends to build up. So the longer growers have to pump water, the more salt is going to build up in the field, the more detriment to the vegetables that they're trying to grow in those fields.
So this year, the Elephant Butte Irrigation District released water allocations early to allow Hatch Valley farmers to flush the salt content out of their fields. Adams says it helps, but it's not enough.
There is no really overcoming. You just pray for river water.
King says it would take multiple snowstorms up in the mountains and the resulting runoff to flush the Hatch Valley's salty soil. At the same time, studies show the salt content in the Rio Grande surface water is also increasing. While farmers adapt to lower water allocations and a more water-scarce future, the groundwater supply that we do have may be at risk of being contaminated. This is Dairy Row, 11 concentrated animal feeding operations lining I-10 just south of Las Cruces, each pumping out an estimated $5.8 million worth of milk every single year. But they're producing more than milk and money. In New Mexico, dairy farms discharge 6.4 million gallons of manure and waste every day, equivalent to the waste generated by about 800,000 people.
You can only go to so many meetings and listen to a dairy owner tell you, well, that's the smell of money.
Mesquite resident Arturo Uribe says the profits of dairy farms nearby are being put before his community's long-term drinking water supply. Dairy runoff, a mixture of cow manure, sterilising chemicals and wasted milk, can leach off farms and contaminate the groundwater below with salts, chlorides and nitrates if not properly managed. According to the EPA, high nitrates can cause blue baby syndrome, a blood disorder that can force babies to vomit, have seizures and even die. Engineer Kathy Martin represents community members concerned about their groundwater.
The nitrate concentrations in the dairy row are between 50 and 100 parts per million. So we're talking 5 to 10 times more than the level where you still can't drink it.
In 2009, the New Mexico Environment Department found that more than 50% of dairies in New Mexico were leaching high levels of nitrates, but Uribe says groundwater contamination from Dairy Row has been going on far longer than that. He says nearby residents have been reluctant to stand up or do anything about it because of their connections to the dairies through work and family. Uribe filed a lawsuit against the dairies, even though one of the dairy owners is his brother-in-law.
It hurt my sister and it hurt her families. You know, it hurt their feelings. I mean, I think they got mad. They were mad, but it wasn't something that we just did.
The lawsuit brought in engineer Bart Farris with the New Mexico Environment Department. He says the contaminated water beneath the dairies south of Las Cruces hasn't got into the drinking water supply yet, but acknowledges even with monitoring, there are still a lot of unknowns.
It's dark down there. So you got to understand that trying to see the details of each site, how water is flowing, how does it move, what's it affecting, how does it react, this chemical, when it hits this certain formation, has to be known to understand what's the best cleanup.
Following a regulatory hearing, the Doñana dairy farmers agreed to do routine groundwater monitoring and line their runoff lagoons with heavy plastic to prevent seepage of contaminants. Ed DeRoida runs 5 of the farms along Dairy Row. He says while dairies are being held to costly regulatory standards, other contributors to groundwater contamination, like owners of leaky residential septic tank systems, are going unchecked.
You know, these costs get too high, well, you know, you just will not be able to continue doing the business. You just have to do something else.
New Mexico's remediation plan is to let the water dilute itself naturally, but the state acknowledges that that process could take up to 20 years, while the Doñana dairies are now required to line their dairy runoff lagoons with plastic. Following a state ruling, dairies throughout the rest of New Mexico only have to use clay liners. Engineer Kathy Martin says they are far less effective, and neither of the containment plans go far enough to stop ongoing dairy contamination.
So the point is, don't let it get into the groundwater in the first place. Have the best liner system you can. Keep your wastewater up above ground, maybe in tanks rather than in pits.
And a lot of people depend on that groundwater. About 15,000 people live in the communities surrounding Dairy Row.
I think they should leave, to be very honest. I mean, I think that they've, you know, you're looking at growing communities, with schools. They're having major, you know, they have major issues with the contamination of the nitrates. You know, it's not a matter of is our aquifers going to be contaminated by nitrates due to the dairies. In my opinion, it's when.
Other potential sources of groundwater contamination include copper mining and oil and gas drilling throughout the state. Every single drop of water in the Rio Grande belongs to someone. Farmers, citizens, municipalities, but none of it is kept for the Rio Grande itself. This is the last of the river's water being delivered to Mexico.
We basically kind of forgot that there's this majestic Rio Grande in our backyard, and we let it degrade.
Beth Bardwell is the Director of Freshwater Conservation at Audubon, New Mexico. She says since the Rio Grande was canalized and re-engineered to deliver water to Mesilla Valley farmers and water users in El Paso, Texas and Mexico, the native vegetation and wildlife the river system supports has been declining.
I think what we're going from is this dynamic, living ecosystem to basically a line in the sand.
So Bardwell helped develop a program to allow farmers' water rights to be traded in and donated back to the Rio Grande's flow.
Whoa, let's see these salt cedars that come up.
Bardwell says that can give replanted native vegetation an edge over invasive plants like the salt cedar Bardwell is pulling out of the ground. While the river's natural ecosystem has been damaged and is declining, lower snowmelt and surface runoff mean the river can't even perform the function it's been engineered to. Phil King says the irrigation system was built on the presumption of an abundant river water supply.
So it's not so much what we do, it's what nature does to us.
Farmers are already fallowing land, drilling deeper groundwater wells, and in some cases going out of business.
That is mankind's way. We do tend to expand to the limits of our resources, and then if our resources contract, it's painful.
But Water Resources Research Institute Director Sam Fernald says drought or not, New Mexico still needs to make major changes in the way it manages its water supply.
Well, in the Southwest, we live in a state of constant scarcity because our demand is always pushing up or exceeding our supply. And then in times of drought, that becomes more apparent.
Fernald says unlike other western states, New Mexico doesn't have a measurement of the state's total water supply. The legislature has not funded all the needed research, so as farmers drill deeper and deeper into the aquifer and pump more and more water out of the ground, Fernald says it's hard to say how long New Mexico's water supply will last.
We're bumping up against the basically limits to use because we're in a drought. So that's why we need these data now and why they didn't have them before, because there wasn't this scarcity driving the need for the research like there is now.
Fernald says the Rio Grande is the main source of groundwater recharge, but a Bureau of Reclamation study predicts the river could lose a third of its water flow by the end of the century. Bardwell says the state of the distressed Rio Grande might be the first sign that how we are using our water in the region is no longer realistic or sustainable.
It tells the story of who we are, and as we see this river increasingly declining, it's really a reflection of what we value and how little we value the natural world, and that doesn't bode well for our future.
The KRWG documentary, Our Water Future, won the New Mexico Broadcasters Association Award for local programming in 2015. Clearly, its message is still of urgent concern. Simon Thompson left the station last year when his visa was not renewed. During the Trump administration, it's been a concern for many immigrants. Simon is back in his home country of Australia after spending some time in Juarez. Next week on Newsmakers, we'll hear an interview with Simon while he was in Mexico. It's part of an encore, a special show on immigration. Our guest is A.D. Alonso, curator of the El Paso exhibit, Make America Great Again, Doors, Not Walls. That's coming up next week. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm Fred Martino. Thanks for being with us.